Hey everybody, welcome to episode 2 of Elder Millennial Podcasts, Rants from a Microplastic Mind. I'm Microplastic Messiah. If you want to know why I called it that, just go to the first episode. I don't know how far the Messiah thing's going to go, but whatever, it was funny, I like alliteration. So I took some notes in a little notebook I have for this episode. I'm just going to kind of pick a topic I guess I want to go off of. Kind of based off, I guess yesterday was kind of interesting because I was on Twitter and that's when yesterday morning was when the hashtag Trump is dead was trending, which was nuts. Obviously it ended up not being true because he's in Virginia, but I think the feedback from it, like the reaction to it, kind of reminds me of the Titan submersible thing. Is just like people were too excited, and to the point where a lot of people were uncomfortable. Like, people shouldn't be this excited over the concept of him passing away. But a lot of people were talking. Well, and it didn't help that, what's his name? JD Vance had been saying in the event that something like that happens, I've been getting the best on the job training for the last 200 days, so he should be able to take over. So that kind of fed into that narrative along with Trump's other health issues. Like, he's an 80-year-old man. Of course he's going to have health issues. But it would be kind of fiercely ironic if he passed before Biden did, especially given how much he used to go after Biden. But I don't know, it's kind of gross watching them debate each other. Like, not because they're old men, but just because it's, two 80-year-olds just like going at each other. And it's like, it's kind of sad. Like, not gross, but like sad, Like, they should be kind of relaxing and retiring, but whatever, it is what it is. So anyway, one of the first notes that popped out to me here was I made a note about how Trump founded Starfleet. And it sounds weird, but in his first term, he was the one who stood up Space Force. And there was a recent video where he was in his office with a bunch of flags and a statue. I can't remember who the statue was of. But in the background, you can see the Space Force flag, and the Space Force logo is just flat out the Star Trek logo. So, like, if we were to carry our plotline forward, and it were to result in Starfleet being created, that means canonically, Trump created Starfleet, which, I don't know, is amusing to me. But it brings to, like, a larger point is that I've brought up is, it's actually, like, in my last episode, I was talking about how Trump is an accidental globalist. And his creation of the Space Force, I think, had unintended consequences that could go on to, like, really spur human investment in space travel. Because by creating the Space Force under the umbrella of national defense, like the Department of National Defense, or what do they call it down there? The Pentagon and all that. What they unintentionally, or maybe intentionally did, was tie defense spending to space travel, which is, like, really exciting, because that means the untold amounts of billions of trillions or whatever dollars that the U.S. spends on defense is now at least partially going to space travel. And I'd kind of like to see a lot of other countries do that, and then liaise with each other, because militaries liaise with each other all the time. Like, militaries of allied nations hold joint exercises and stuff. So I think it would be cool if, like, because I'm Canadian, if Canada were to stand up a Space Force, so I could finally be a space cadet like the people always said I was. So yeah, that was one point I kind of wanted to get out there. Another point I had was Trump. Okay. Trump's, one of his first big pushes was to get everybody back into the office. Like, he doesn't want remote workers. And for whatever reason he says he wants it, it isn't the reason. Like, if you look at, because Trump's family is all commercial real estate developers in the States, so he has a vested interest in making sure that people are going back to work, because especially with COVID and all the work from home stuff, there was so many articles talking about how downtowns were dying. Like, you lose the foot traffic and all the commercial real estate is not being used because everyone's working from home. So now you have a president who's a commercial real estate agent, or was before he became president. And, like, yeah, of course he's going to push for everybody to go back because he wants his real estate properties to do well. even though he allegedly like puts things in a blind trust, but like I don't trust that for a second. So yeah, that was another point. Um, on the topic of unintended consequences too, another note I had was so like the Russia Ukraine war. I know this is kind of pivoting, but whatever, get used to it if you're gonna hang out here. um, so when the Russia Ukraine conflict happened, and I was recently in a Twitter debate about all this whole thing, was like Russia was saying that like Russia's point of view, if you listen to the people who are kind of like on the side of Russia, is that um, NATO is pushing too close to their border. So if you're like, let's say, sure, like, yeah, NATO was pushing too close to their borders. And people say that there was a coup in Ukraine. That's what resulted in Zelensky being president. I don't honestly really know. Like, I don't know. I wasn't tracking much on Ukraine till the war happened. But like, the fierce irony of like, of Russia pushing into Ukraine is that it united NATO in a way that it hadn't been since its creation. Like again, on the topic of Trump being an unintentional globalist, NATO wasn't really doing well in the lead up to the Ukraine war. Like their relevance as an organization was being questioned. And a lot of the countries honestly did rely on the US. Like everybody assumed that we would have the kind of global like order, the global world order that we've had since like World War II, where the US would just kind of protect everybody. But that now that Trump is in and he's kind of dialed back support for Ukraine, it honestly has made Europe stand up a lot of their military. Like if you look a lot of news articles, countries that weren't a part of NATO now are. I think it was like Sweden and Finland joined NATO. Like basically any country that feels like they could be threatened by Russian expansion is joining NATO. So by trying to like restrict NATO, he's like empowering them so much more than they were. Like I don't know if that was what he wanted when he started that. Like the theory I heard was the reason he wanted Crimea is because Russia's doesn't have reliable access to like the oceans. So then they pushed for Crimea, and then part of the reason for the invasion of Ukraine was to link up a land bridge. So he wanted to take the eastern oblasts, I think they're called, like provinces of Ukraine, so that it could connect to Crimea. And that seems to be bear out in the peace negotiations, is he wants at least those provinces, you know. And that kind of to me confirms that anyway. But yeah, he kind of accidentally like empowered the thing he was completely fighting against. And that's why I'm never sure if these are intended or unintended consequences, but they always seem unintended. But it goes to my point from last episode about, I feel like inevitably we have to move to a world government, and people, what's that line from? It's like, the more you try to fight your destiny, the quicker you move towards it, or something like that. I'd have to look it up, but yeah, I think it's something like that. And another point I have in my notes here from the Ukraine conflict is it's actually spurred a ton of technological advancement. Like there's a saying, I don't know if it's a saying, but there's a philosophy that war tends to be a catalyst for technological advancement. I think we've been seeing that in the Ukraine war, because I don't know if any of you have been watching the videos on YouTube and TikTok of how the conflict's been going, but like the drone warfare is absolutely crazy. Like I've seen video now where they have trucks, like box trucks basically, full of 3D printers, and they're just pumping drones out like mad. And then like I've spent some time in the military. Like I'm not trying to give away too much personal information, but yeah, I've spent some time in the military. I'll say it's 10 plus years, but for that, just to give a little context there. And during my time in, it was like you'd hear old guys, like the old guards, say things like, these kids these days know their way around an Xbox controller way more than a rifle, which was true for sure. I mean, with budget cuts, we didn't get a ton of range time, but that's neither here nor there. So, but yeah, it's like, even though it's true, you're watching the videos in the Ukraine war now, and it's, what do they call them? FPV drones, which sounds like something you should be able to get a vaccination for, but no, it's first person view drones. So you're flying them from the first person, and they have video from these first person drones, and they're flying towards tanks and like taking out these tanks. Like if you know anything about tanks, like particularly Russian tanks, there's like vulnerabilities between like where the turret is. You don't have to just watch any war movie and you'll know that. So then they target these locations and just take out a tank. And if you don't know, like a tank has 3 to 4 guys in it, depending on the type of tank. So you just took out 4 guys who were pretty good with their rifles, and it was by some kid with an Xbox controller probably 3 kilometers away, which I find fiercely ironic. And now they're talking about having ground robots too, which we've already seen. They have, it's like a low bed kind of platform with treads on it. And you can see these on YouTube and TikTok, and it just, like if you have a wounded soldier or something, you can use a reconnaissance drone to see where he is and direct a ground robot to drive up beside the guy, and he just loads himself in and pulls the wounded out. And they can deliver supplies, and they're mounting guns to them. Like, it is absolutely crazy what this war is doing to technology. It's definitely way different than anything we fought before, and no one really knows what's going to come of it. Like, they had that recent deployment where Ukraine like pre-positioned drone carrying trucks, like semi trucks would drop off trailers with full of drones, and then at a predetermined time the top would open, these drone swarms would come out and take out a ton of Russian like super expensive aircraft. Which actually kind of brings me to another point too, is like, this is kind of a repeated lesson that we've seen in different conflicts. If you ever seen the movie Hearts War with Tom Hanks, it goes into the conflict in Afghanistan, and you're probably thinking of the US conflict, but no, we're talking about the Russian conflict in like the 70s, I think, 70s and 80s. Russia was in Afghanistan. What did I say? Did I say Ukraine? Well, I meant Afghanistan. But anyway, we're talking about the Afghanistan conflict. So that's the ADD again. But so Russia was in Afghanistan, and they were pretty deeply embedded. Like, they were still getting fought by the Mujahideen, which the CIA trained to fight Russia, but that's a whole nother thing. And then the Afghanis were having trouble getting Russia out, and the US had an interest in helping them do so. But the main problem they were having was with like Russian armor and attack helicopters, because like in as much as you can try and help people fight against the Russians, you can't do it unless you give them the means to take out their more expensive assets, I'll say. So they were begging for Stinger missiles, I think they were called, like the shoulder-mounted ones, but the US didn't want to give them to them because they were like newer technology and they're pretty expensive. It was like 50 grand a pop. But in the movie Hearts War, you can see Tom Hanks's character as a senator is like really pushing to get these people these weapons, and eventually he does, and it's super effective. Like, because in as much as the rockets are like 50 grand a pop or something like that, they used it to take out a $16 million chopper, like, you know, a couple $1 million tanks. Like, it just became cost ineffective to stay in Afghanistan. And really the main thing one of the main reasons that Russia got out was because they got the shoulder-mounted rockets, and then it became cost ineffective to stay there. So then I think the U.S. kind of learned that lesson, because in like some of the first TikToks I was seeing was Russia came in with helicopters and tanks, and the Ukrainians pretty much instantly already had the shoulder-mounted rockets. So you'd see a $50,000 shoulder-mounted rocket take out like a $16 million chopper, and like, yeah, I don't know if the Russians just didn't learn that lesson from Afghanistan or what, but yeah, the whole conflict smacks to me of like, I think it's pretty obvious that Russian generals were lying to Putin the whole time, you know? Like, Putin would probably be like, how's our military? And the Russian generals didn't want any trouble, so they were like, and they were probably all corrupt and, you know, what do you call it? Scalping off the top of everything. I mean, I don't really know how the Russian military works, but that's just kind of the vibe I get. So then they were like, yeah, man, everything's good. And then he's like, hey, we're going to invade Ukraine. And they're like, uh-oh. And then that's when the holes in the Russian military became pretty clear. And suddenly generals got really clumsy and started falling out of windows all the time. You see those articles all the time. These guys are so klutzy, keep falling out of windows. But yeah. And like, I see that. I mean, I think everybody with a job sees that, you know? Like, civilian or military, it doesn't matter. Like, there's always the guy at the top who's like, I want things to work this way. And then the middle managers who are like, yep, it's totally working that way. And then the guys on the front lines who are like, wow, they're that is not how things are going at all. And like, people on the bottom who actually care will try to make changes, and then that kind of threatens middle management, if that makes sense, because it's like, well, he's actually they're actually exposing like all the stuff that's not going on, so or that's supposed to happen that isn't actually happening, you know. So I think that's what happened with Russia, was they were so overconfident based on the lies the generals were telling. That's one aspect of it for sure. And that actually goes into another point I wrote in my notes here about lying to get into war. Like, we've seen that happen a few times too, like with the weapons of mass destruction. I don't want to get too into that from like Iraq, but I remember back when that war was spooling up, they were talking about WMDs and weapons of mass destruction, and the people who were critical of the US government were like, well, of course we know they have them. We gave it to them. Like, the US constantly was training assets in the Middle East and giving them arms to do what the US wanted. So, of course, they knew they had, you know, certain assets because they had the receipts. But from what I've seen, it was like chemical weapons, and the UN inspectors went in and said that they didn't have them, but they just lied about it and went in anyway. Like, I think that's something we always have to be conscious of, is like, whatever reason that the government or leadership is giving for something to happen, we need to really scrutinize it, you know? We can't just be blind and just believe everything they say. Which kind of goes into my point from like my last episode when I was talking about if the US would actually try and take over Canada. The main question to me, and I'm not going to like really go into any of the points, so you can just go back if you want to. And yeah, it was like, even if they started making moves towards putting boots on the ground in Canada, would the US troops support it? And the main thing in the stories that I've been seeing lately with the National Guard deployments to the US states and the ICE deployments is, it reminds me, and I know there's too many like comparisons to Nazism in World War II, but if you look at like the Nazi troops, they must have seen, like, they must have known that bad things were happening. And there was a guy, I want to say, I can't remember who it was exactly, but I was watching a video, and it was a really compelling one, because it was like, everybody talks about Nazis like they're monsters or whatever, and that's, calling people monsters is usually an attempt to dehumanize them, but they really were just human beings, you know, who made choices. And if you, this guy, again, I want to say it was Nietzsche, but I could be wrong. Anyway, it was some philosopher was talking about, you need to do a mental exercise of putting yourself in the shoes of, say, like a policeman working in Germany and the rise of Nazism, and the stuff that, and read their stories about what the choices they had to make, because it was like, either I have to do these things, like help set up a concentration camp, or someone else is going to have to do it, like either way. And everybody likes to think that they would be the more humane version of what actually happened back then, but you need to really do some serious thought exercises about what was going on and read some of the actual stories from back then to really understand. And I'm seeing a lot of parallels now, like a lot of the people joining ICE, for example, are people who are just looking for a stable job. And then they find themselves doing these raids, and they might not even necessarily believe in it, but are they going to sacrifice the employment they found, like, to do the right thing? And history has kind of shown us that people won't. Like, people kind of will put themselves first for the most part. Like, everybody wants to believe they'll sacrifice. But I think it's an important thought exercise for everybody, is like, if you're actually put in this position, will you do what you consider to be the right thing? And that's the main question to me, is like, if the orders come down from the US to like start moving troops into Canada, will those troops do the right thing? Because to me, the bravest people in the Ukraine conflict right now are obviously the Ukrainian soldiers fighting the Russians, and the Russian people who are like disobeying or protesting in a police state like Russia, you know, the people who are actually fighting to just end the war, you know. Yeah. I feel like some of those might have been kind of risky things to say, and I hope I navigated that okay, but yeah, I'm doing my best. But yeah, I hope if it comes down to it, like, the average trooper, especially the officers, will just say, that's not a legal order, you can go away now. So then another point from my notes is, like, there's been a lot of talk about how the U.S. has been basically running an empire, but it's more of an economic empire than any other. Especially because, okay, a lot of the main reason we have the global order that we have right now is because of the invention of nukes. Like, if we look at the past, what was it, 90 years since the World War II ended, we don't see conventional conflict as much. Like, Ukraine is an exception for sure, but I think because of nukes, people don't want conflicts to get too big, because we've finally reached the point where if conflict gets too big, it could result in the destruction of the entire planet. So the globe already has come together in a degree. I've been talking about globalism a lot, but the globe has already come together, I feel, in that they don't want war to get so big that we not accidentally, but on purpose, nuke the planet into, you know, extinction. And that has tampered down conflict and resulted in like the Cold War and a lot of the proxy wars we're seeing. But I think that's why everyone too is especially anxious about the Ukraine conflict and the concern that it'll get bigger. Because if it gets big, it could get as big as you can get, which is, you know, destruction of the planet. And everybody wants to avoid that. But at the same time, we're seeing kind of the, not end, but leveling off of the U.S. empire. Like, things have been slowly chipping away at U.S. supremacy, mostly China, I would say, is, and with the rise of Trump, they've been talking about how the U.S. has lost a lot of its soft power. And I think you can see other countries are trying to step up into that power vacuum, like China, India, a lot of the European countries. Yeah, they see an opening for them to kind of gain some control over their lives and the direction the world is going in, but especially China with their Belt and Road Initiative, kind of investing in other areas, like especially Africa too. There's that one guy, I don't know his name. I've only seen him in a few clips, but there's been a few people that try to unite Africa, because it's a big place with a lot of resources too. So, and they are kind of sick of being colonized, kind of understandably, and they kind of want to run their own show. And if China's going to give them the ability to do that, I think they will. I think we should probably keep an eye, like not keep an eye, but that's where more interesting things are going to be coming in the next generation, I'll say, is probably we'll see the rise of Africa. But I'm curious to see how that goes, especially because South Africa is part of the BRICS, which gives Africa inroads to like more power and control than maybe they've had before. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing at all. Like, Africa is a huge place with lots of people, and it absolutely should be, and resources too, and they should be able to dictate kind of what happens with their resources. But I know a lot of American international corporations, or not necessarily American, but just corporations, because really they're kind of more in charge of anything than the government is. Like, I'm getting kind of rambly here, but I mean, it's my podcast, so whatever. Like, we talk about governments like they're the ones that are in charge, but really it feels like governments are just kind of 7 corporations in a trench coat sometimes, you know, especially with the prevalence of lobbyists. It feels like we've taken corruption and just called it lobbying. Yeah, it's just the amount of power they control, especially the oil lobbies. But if you look at the history of transportation, that's kind of where the oil lobbies kind of came in was like if you looked at the Industrial Revolution, it was a ton of ideas coming about, like so many ideas, and everyone was kind of just trying to see what would fit. And I think we could have had like more of an emphasis on public transit, but then car culture kind of started taking over. We lost a lot of that. Like cars didn't have to be the be all end all. We could have had a strong public transit to get from city to city, and then had cars for getting around in cities or something. Like we could have had a middle ground, but it seems like cars pretty much took over, which meant the car companies and the oil barons and stuff, that's where all their power came from, was because everybody was driving cars. And you can see it in the layout of cities. Like there's been a lot of talk about the like North America kind of adopting more of the European style of city planning, where you have 15-minute cities with mixed zoning, where you don't have to drive across the city and go to a big parking lot, because those kinds of cities were designed around cars, like specifically designed around the maximal use of vehicles. And then, but there is an alternative, like we could have walkable cities and we could have better public transit, but that would cut into the car culture. So obviously they're going to lobby against it. I'm kind of hoping, and then we're seeing the rise of new technologies, especially green technologies, kind of cutting into the oil profits. And I'm kind of in the middle ground on this. Is like, I think green energy is important, and I wish cities could be more designed around, say, electric scooters or something for short term. Like you could have different types of transit. Like you could have rail transit, like the trains. Like in Edmonton, we had the what do they call it? They had the train that kind of cut across, and Calgary has trains and like subways and stuff. So to get from one part of the city to another, you'd use a train, and then to get around in like the 20-minute kind of circle of where you're in, you could have like e-scooters or something like that. Like we could design cities to be a bit more efficient, especially like I saw a video in, I want to say it was China, where like you could be walking through a park and you could see a KFC kiosk, and you would sit there and you'd place your order, and then a drone would just fly your order in, land in the top of the kiosk, and drop off your food. I think that's really cool. And you're also already kind of seeing it with like DoorDash and all the food delivery, Uber kind of stuff, Uber Eats, that kind of stuff. Some people say it's wasteful, but when you think about it, if you're looking at it from like an environmentalist point of view, it's actually a really good thing, because say 20 people in a neighborhood order DoorDash, that's one car going out to get 20 orders to bring it to their houses, instead of 20 cars driving to the Uber Eats or whatever, or driving to McDonald's to get the food. So environmentally, it's actually better, even though it's not the most cost-effective thing in the world. But yeah, same with grocery deliveries. Like the more we have stuff delivered, the less vehicles need to be on the road, which saves the environment. Like there's a lot of benefits to it, I think. But then anytime you have some kind of cultural change like that, you're going to end up with people who, were benefiting under the old way of doing things. The big example that everybody seems to be using is like everything's changing because of AI, which means people are going to lose their jobs. But then the metaphor that people always use is like, it's like if you were a guy who worked with horses right when cars were starting to be a big thing. Those guys might have not necessarily lost their jobs, but they had to change their focus to a different industry. So I think we're gonna have to see a shift in industries. Like all industries are probably going to be changing, and then it's a question of whether or not those industries are going to have enough jobs to really accommodate all the people that we have, or whether we're going to have I think we're going to inevitably have to move to like a UBI, like I said in the last episode, where everybody gets paid a certain amount of money, because in a consumer economy, your existence has meaning from just being a consumer, like I'm sitting here looking at a shelf of books that I own. Well, I wouldn't own those if I didn't exist, which means those people wouldn't have had jobs writing or binding them or selling them. Everybody exists, or all these jobs exist because people exist. But if people don't have the means to buy things, then how do you sustain a consumer economy? So then I think eventually we're going to have to move to that, where everybody kind of has a base standard of living that is maintained, And you can get more on top of it if you work. Because then when you think about it, it's honestly better for, well, depending on how it works out, if they implement it, is like employers then don't have to spend as much on wages either. Because like say we set the standard of living at 100,000 a year. I know that's high, but let's just say for argument's sake, we put it at the amount, the standard of living that someone who makes 100,000 a year is what everyone's going to get base. Well, then what if I want more than, well, maybe 100,000 is high, let's say 80, whatever, it doesn't matter. So let's say I want more than that. Well, then I go to an employer, like, and an employer would be someone who needs tasks performed by a human, and for whatever reason it can't be done by robots and AI. Then you would just go to that person and say, hey, I want a job. And they'd say, we have a job for you. And they only have to pay you like, 10 grand or something. Because really, you have everything you need. The employer is only paying you a bonus. So the employer only needs to spend 10,000 on wages. I know that's like communism or whatever, or socialism, but I'm sick of the isms. Like, call it whatever you want. I don't care. As long as people are taken care of, because then you have the wage base for people to buy your shit. Like, I feel like it just makes so much sense. But the way things are these days, I don't think people push for it because there's too much like control with how things have always been. And it would be too big of a change too quick. So it'd be something that we'd have to like kind of gradually work towards. But I don't know if like the planet's going to be able to sustain that. So it might have to move quicker than we thought. Because right now we're in an attention-based economy, and I had a note here as like attention is valuable, and that's why it's paid. Like that's why you have to pay attention. It's incredibly valuable, and we've monetized attention through what I'm doing right now, and YouTube content and that kind of thing, because the internet drew people's attention to advertising, which spurred business, but it opened up a whole attention-based economy. But yeah, we could just move to, and consumerism is kind of attention based because you're only going to buy things that you pay attention to or that draw your attention. But then I think the value in, like, the biggest value in having a UBI and having a certain standard of living for everybody is that you're going to be able to have, it sounds bad, but you're going to be able to maximally exploit everybody. Or I think a better way to put it is everybody will have the opportunity to contribute to society in the maximal way. Because when you think about it, like the big example I came up with is the best web developer in the universe could have been a poor kid living in 1300s. Because really a lot of people's success is opportunity and timing. Because like say Mark Zuckerberg grew up as a poor kid in a poor country or something. I don't want to name one because that would kind of douchey, but like say Mark Zuckerberg didn't grow up where he did or have the circumstances that he did, would we have Facebook? And it's the same with everybody. I think the best example though has to be Alan Turing. Like if you ever watched the movie The Imitation Game, like that movie hits it on the head. Like Alan Turing was a genius who was way ahead of his time, bit of a loner. And I think if you watch that movie, and it might help you understand kind of my personality too. I'm not going to say I'm anywhere near as intelligent as him, but I am as socially awkward. I'll say that. But like what happened to him is a perfect example. Like if he had been born at a different time when being homosexual was okay, God knows what he could have done. But since he grew up in a time where like circumstances out of his control resulted in his genius being stunted early, like God knows what he could have done. And you got to figure like there's got to be so many stories like that. Like everybody has something they can contribute. Even like everybody contributes to the universe just by their sheer existence. Like that contributes. But everybody could contribute more if they were given the freedom and resources to pursue their passions to the maximal extent and just remove those boundaries, I think about that a lot. That's why I use the example of like the world's best web developer could have been born as a poor shoe like cobbler or something in the 1300s. Like, and it's not his fault. He was born before the internet, before he ever had a chance to even do anything like that or had any opportunity. And we can't do anything about the past, but we can like try to work towards the future being more like, again, Star Trek. Everyone has the resources and time to pursue their interests to the peak. We could end up with like the peak people, like the very best people that like not ugh, not like morally best, but like you know what I mean, like the most talented. We could really draw people's talent out if we could remove the boundaries of having to like be a wage slave to pay for their rent. Like if everybody's just basic needs are taken care of, they can focus on being the best they can be at whatever they want to do. And that's why I have a problem with like the whole survival of the fittest mentality. Like having spent a bunch of time in the military, you hear some people talk about survival of the fittest, and they picture, I think what they picture is something like the 300, you know, the Spartans, where it's like they were just focused on war and they were the strongest and fittest and the best killers and stuff. But well, Sparta's not around anymore, and it didn't even like do well as a country for like obvious reasons. Like there's a scene in the 300 where they run into the Athenians, and it's like, hey, what's your profession? And he's like, well, I'm a potter. It's like, what are you? Well, I'm a sculptor. And then all the 300 are like, what's your profession? And they chant, you know, because they're all soldiers. They were trained from the beginning to be soldiers. And like, sure, that gave them advantage. They were very skilled soldiers, but the problem with the Spartan method was it wasn't scalable, and they weren't able, like, they created great soldiers, but they weren't able to create enough of them, and their culture eventually, you know, failed. So I don't really think they're a good example of survival of the fittest. Because even if you look at, say, an army marching those kinds of distances needs people with different skill sets. Like they probably needed like what if the Spartans were marching and they had a pot that broke? Well, it'd be nice to have a potter around, you know? And that goes into my, I don't know if it's true or not, but my theory on why Smith is a really, really common Western name is because blacksmiths were highly skilled tradesmen who were brought in during conflict. So they would often survive wars because they weren't put in danger. So Smith is really popular because blacksmiths either like weren't put in the conflict, or they would survive the conflict, or even if, say, they were in the war, if they were captured, they would still be utilized. They wouldn't have been killed. Like the army that captured them would have probably just kept them and be like, hey, you work for us now. So yeah, because a lot of the family names were based on what you did. Like I had a French guy named Péchon, which is French for hot bread, which means his family probably came from a line of bakers or something. But like, I think that's why Smith is, it's like a utilitarian thing. Is like, that name exists because a lot of Smiths were highly valuable, skilled tradesmen. And when you have that kind of value, you're not going to get put in danger, if that makes sense. But I mean, I think that should be true of everybody, because I think everybody kind of has something they can contribute. They just need to be able to figure out what it is. And the movie Imitation Game too, like, it wasn't just that, like, it showed how, like, that was a perfect example of what I'm trying to talk about. Because, like, Alan Turing was a weirdo and a homosexual at a time when being homosexual got you charged. And then he recruited a woman. I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but it was the one played by Keira Knightley. And women weren't supposed to be in positions like the one that he put her in, but he did it anyway. Like, and the irony too is that some of the people in the concentration camps, like people talk about the Jews were in concentration camps, but they also rounded up homosexuals and neurodivergent people and put them in those camps too. So I don't want to say it's ironic, but I can't really think of the term, but like the people that the Nazis were getting rid of are the very people who came about and made sure that they would lose the war. Like Alan Turing broke Enigma and like helped end the war, and if he was in Germany, he would have been put on a train, you know, to go to one of the concentration camps. And I think that's just a fierce example of how like we need to be able to let everybody contribute in the best way that they can if we want the best society, if that makes sense. I'm super rambly today, but whatever. It's going to be a interesting episode to edit, I suppose. wanted to record just a quick interlude because there's a part in the Imitation Game where he says sometimes it's the people no one imagines anything of who can do the things that no one imagines, and that just kind of fits in with exactly what I was saying. I wanted to include that, but I forgot. So back to the regular scheduled program. And then the fact that he because after the war he was a war hero, but obviously had to keep it secret, and then he ends up getting chemically castrated and kills himself. It's such a sad ending to a great man, a great person. Yeah, it's terrible. Yeah, it sucks to end on a kind of a sad note like that, but I think I'm good for today. So if you hung out, thanks for hanging out. This one was a little shorter than the last one, but I mean, I haven't really set on a determined length for these, but yeah, thanks for coming to episode 2 of the Elder Millennial podcast. I'm Microplastic Messiah. Have a good day.